Tina Matthews woke up that morning like any other. The sun streamed through the kitchen window as she brewed her coffee, the aroma filling the air. It was a typical Tuesday, the kind of day she usually welcomed with the routine hum of her bakery, Tina's Delights, nestled in the heart of town. Her small business was doing well, but success never made her complacent. She spent long hours behind the counter, mixing dough, icing cakes, and chatting with loyal customers. The business, born from her dream years ago, had become more than just a livelihood, it was a community gathering point. But while she was well known for her humble demeanor and hard work, few people knew the full extent of her influence. On the surface, Tina Matthews was the quiet woman who ran the bakery. But behind the scenes, she had become a silent powerhouse. Tina's Delights was thriving, not just because of her passion for baking but because of her ability to make strategic, often quiet, decisions in the world of business. The bakery's success had allowed her to invest in other ventures, including a significant stake in the local bank, Pioneer National Bank, which she had been building over the years. She never liked to boast about her wealth, nor did she need to. Her identity wasn't tied to money, it was tied to the sweat and tears she'd poured into her work. But today, as she was about to discover, her identity would be tested in ways she never expected. Tina finished her coffee, grabbed a file of business paperwork, and headed out the door. She was due for a routine check at Pioneer National Bank, a place she'd done business with for years, not just as a customer but now as one of the bank's major shareholders. The bank had always treated her with the respect she deserved, until now. Little did Tina know, this would be the day that changed everything. The doors of the bank opened with a soft chime as she walked in. She greeted the receptionist with a friendly smile, though the woman's face barely registered any recognition. As Tina made her way to the counter, her eyes met Thomas Reynolds, the bank manager. A man in his mid-50s with salt and pepper hair, Thomas had always been courteous, but there was something about him, something in his demeanor, that never sat right with Tina. He never seemed particularly warm toward her, but she brushed it off. Perhaps it was just a professional distance. Still, she couldn't ignore the subtle glances and the faint air of superiority he exuded, a tone she had come to expect in certain circles of business. "Good morning, Mr. Reynolds," Tina said, setting the envelope with the check down on the counter. "I'd like to cash this check for the bakery." Thomas glanced down at the check without lifting his gaze fully. Tina noticed the slight frown that appeared on his face as he ran his fingers over the details of the check. He paused, clearly hesitant, then spoke in a calm but dismissive tone. "Ms. Matthews, I'm afraid there's an issue with this check. The details don't match our records, and I'll need to hold off processing it until we resolve the discrepancy." Tina's heart skipped a beat. She could feel the tension in the air as the other customers in line glanced her way, sensing something was off. "What kind of discrepancy?" she asked, trying to keep her voice steady. Thomas didn't meet her eyes. "The account number and the signature don't match up with what we have in our system. I'm afraid I can't process it without further verification." Tina felt a sudden wave of frustration rise in her chest. She'd written that check herself, signed it with her personal signature, she knew there was no mistake. But she also knew Thomas didn't seem to care much for her explanations. The way he spoke, almost like she didn't belong in his world, wasn't lost on her. She wasn't naive. She had been in enough business dealings to recognize the subtle biases that people like Thomas often carried, even if they tried to hide them. "I assure you," she began, keeping her voice level but firm, "this check is legitimate. I'm the owner of Tina's Delights, you've processed checks from me before. There's no reason for any discrepancy." Thomas glanced at her again, his eyes narrowing slightly. He looked as if he was about to speak, then hesitated. "I'll need to verify this with corporate," he said, avoiding direct eye contact. "This is standard procedure. I can't process it without confirmation." Tina's patience was running thin, but she remained calm. The usual polite smile she wore began to fade, replaced by the cool professionalism she'd developed after years of handling difficult situations in business. She could feel the eyes of the other customers on her, the weight of their judgment as if she were a woman trying to pull a fast one. She wasn't a stranger to such looks. But today, something about this felt different, more personal. "I don't understand," Tina said, trying to keep her voice steady despite the growing knot in her stomach. "I've been a customer here for years, and I've never had an issue like this. I'm simply trying to cash a check." Thomas barely looked at her now, his attention seemingly more on the paperwork in front of him than the person standing across the counter. His dismissive attitude only grew stronger as he spoke again. "I'll get back to you once I've confirmed everything. In the meantime, I'm afraid I can't process your request." Tina's heart sank. There was a moment of silence between them, thick with tension. People around them continued with their business, seemingly unaware of the quiet storm that was brewing in the corner of the bank. Tina stood there, holding her breath, her fingers clenched around the envelope. She wasn't just an ordinary customer. She wasn't just a baker with a small shop. No, Tina Matthews was much more than that, though Thomas didn't know it yet. He didn't realize that the very bank he worked for was partially owned by her. She wasn't just any client. But right now, she felt like an outsider in a place that was supposed to serve her. Tina glanced at Thomas one last time, a mix of disbelief and frustration clouding her mind. "I'll wait for your call," she said, her voice sharp now. She turned on her heel and walked out of the bank, her face a mask of composure. Inside, however, she was seething. How dare he treat her like that? She didn't know it yet, but that moment, right there in that sterile bank lobby, was the beginning of a much larger change. What happened next would not only change Tina's life but would have a ripple effect that no one could have anticipated. As Tina left Pioneer National Bank, the weight of the encounter settled heavily on her shoulders. She didn't let it show on her face, but inside, a mix of anger, frustration, and confusion churned. How could Thomas Reynolds, a man who worked in a place she had helped build with her investments, treat her like some kind of fraud? She had been a loyal customer for years, someone who had put money into the very institution he represented. Yet, today, he had treated her with an almost casual disregard that felt personal. The cool wind hit her face as she stepped out into the street, and she paused for a moment, collecting herself. The town wasn't large, and everyone seemed to know everyone else. She could feel the eyes of a few passers-by as they glanced in her direction, likely wondering why she had left the bank so abruptly. Her friend Marcus, a regular at her bakery, happened to be walking down the street when he spotted her. He was a few paces behind her, and as he caught up, his concerned expression immediately caught her attention. "Tina, what happened? You okay?" he asked, his voice laced with concern. Tina gave him a tight-lipped smile, though it didn't quite reach her eyes. "Yeah, I'm fine. Just some confusion at the bank," she replied, trying to downplay the situation. But the more she thought about it, the more her frustration bubbled up. She had been given the cold shoulder without reason, and it stung. She was no stranger to the occasional bout of discrimination. Life had taught her to face that head-on, but something about this felt different. It wasn't just the casual snub or the lack of professionalism, there was an air of superiority in Thomas's demeanor that didn't sit right with her. "I'm going back in," Tina said suddenly, her voice firm now. "I'm not letting this slide." Marcus raised an eyebrow. "Wait, what? You can't just go back in there, Tina. You've already been dismissed. Let's just let it go." But Tina, never one to back down from a challenge, wasn't about to let it go. "No, Marcus. This isn't just about the check. This is about something deeper. It's about how people like Thomas treat others like they're beneath them. I'm not going to let him think he can just push me around." Without waiting for a response, Tina turned on her heel and started walking back toward the bank. Marcus, with a resigned sigh, fell into step beside her. "You know, this could cause a lot of drama. You really want to go through with this? Tina didn't answer at first. She was too focused on the need to confront what had just happened. It wasn't just an issue with the check. It was about respect. It was about showing people that she, too, deserved to be treated fairly, no matter how much money or influence she had. She wasn't someone to be brushed aside or ignored. As they approached the bank, Tina's mind raced with thoughts of what she would say. She wasn't sure exactly what she expected, maybe just an apology, maybe a simple acknowledgement of her rights as a customer. But as she stepped through the door again, the reception area felt even colder. The same receptionist who had barely acknowledged her earlier gave her a quick glance, but this time Tina didn't let it slide. She walked straight up to the counter where Thomas was speaking with a colleague. "Mr. Reynolds," Tina said, her voice firm but controlled. "I need to speak with you. Now." Thomas looked up in surprise, and for a moment, Tina saw something flicker across his face, regret, perhaps, or maybe disbelief that she was standing there again. "Ms. Matthews, I told you I needed to verify the check. You can't just—" "I'm not here for more verification," Tina interrupted, her tone cutting through the air. "I'm here to address the way I was treated. I've been a customer here for years. And I'm more than that, Mr. Reynolds. I am one of the bank's shareholders, and I'm beginning to think you didn't realize that." Thomas's face drained of color. He stammered, searching for words but finding none. Tina watched him closely, her eyes never leaving his. This was the moment. This was where everything changed. "I don't care about your personal biases or your attitudes. I've worked hard to get where I am, and I expect the same respect as any other person who walks in here." There was a long pause. The other bank employees had stopped what they were doing and were watching the exchange now. Tina didn't look away from Thomas, her gaze steady and unwavering. He finally cleared his throat, glancing around nervously as though seeking some kind of validation from the others. "Ms. Matthews, I didn't know," he began weakly. "I didn't realize. I apologize." His apology was weak, and Tina didn't buy it. It wasn't enough. Not by a long shot. "I don't want your apology, Mr. Reynolds. What I want is for you to understand that actions like yours, small, seemingly insignificant slights, add up. They build up over time, and they affect people's lives. You don't get to treat people like they're invisible, especially not someone who has invested in this very bank. I'm going to make sure this doesn't happen again. I won't let it slide." She turned to leave, Marcus still by her side, though now he was quiet, sensing the shift in her energy. As they walked out of the bank, Tina's heart pounded in her chest. She had done what she came to do, she had confronted the source of her frustration. But she wasn't done yet. This incident was just the beginning. She had made it clear that she wasn't someone to be dismissed or ignored, and now, she intended to make sure Thomas Reynolds, and everyone else, understood that. As they stepped back onto the street, Tina felt a sense of quiet resolve wash over her. She had taken a stand, and though she didn't know it yet, it would set off a chain of events that would force not just Thomas but the entire community to reckon with the impact of their actions. What had seemed like a simple banking mishap would soon unravel in ways no one could have predicted, and Tina Matthews would be at the center of it all. The following days felt like an emotional roller coaster for Tina. Though she had stood her ground at the bank, something about the confrontation lingered in the back of her mind. It wasn't just about what had happened, it was about what it represented. In a small town like theirs, where everyone seemed to know everyone, word traveled fast. The encounter with Thomas Reynolds quickly became the topic of conversation, and Tina had a feeling that the ripple effect of that day would soon reach far beyond her. At first, the response was subtle. Tina received a few messages from customers who'd heard what had happened, many offering their support or expressing disbelief at how she'd been treated. She appreciated their words, but she knew that the real battle wasn't in the words, it was in the actions that followed. As much as she wanted to move on from the incident, something in her gut told her this wasn't going to blow over easily. It wasn't just a personal slight anymore, it had become a symbol of something much larger. People in the town started whispering, wondering how a simple, routine banking experience had turned into something so much more. By the end of the week, things had escalated. A local reporter from the town gazette, a woman named Emma Hayes, had gotten wind of the story. Emma was known for her hard-hitting journalism, especially when it came to issues of social justice, and Tina knew that if the story hit the paper, it would change everything. Sure enough, by Friday morning, Tina woke up to a headline splashed across the front page of the newspaper: "Bank manager's bias sparks controversy after refusing check from local businesswoman. What happens next?" Tina stared at the headline in disbelief. She hadn't expected this kind of attention, though in hindsight, she should have known better. The piece was thorough, highlighting the details of the incident and raising questions about why someone like Thomas Reynolds, a man in a position of power, had treated her so poorly. Emma's article didn't hold back, calling attention to the racial undertones of the situation, suggesting that Thomas's actions had been more than just a simple mistake. It was an example of how biases could manifest in subtle ways that affected people's lives. The piece was a firestorm. It sparked heated conversations across town, with many people divided over the issue. Some defended Tina, agreeing that she had been treated unfairly and that Thomas's behavior was unacceptable. Others, however, dismissed it, saying that it was simply a misunderstanding and that people were reading too much into it. There were even those who suggested that Tina was overreacting, making a mountain out of a molehill. But the more Tina thought about it, the more she realized that the incident wasn't just about her, it was about the power dynamics in their town, about how people in positions of authority had the ability to make others feel small or invisible. Often without even realizing it. The backlash didn't take long to reach Pioneer National Bank. By Monday morning, Thomas was called into a meeting with the board of directors. As one of the bank's key stakeholders, Tina had enough influence to request a meeting of her own. She wasn't sure what she was expecting, perhaps an apology, perhaps a formal review of Thomas's actions, but she knew that this was a critical moment for her. She wanted to make sure that no one else would ever experience what she had gone through. The meeting was scheduled for late afternoon, and as Tina walked into the bank's conference room, she could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on her. She was flanked by her lawyer, who had advised her to bring legal representation, just in case things took an unexpected turn. The room was sterile, cold, the kind of place where decisions were made without ever considering the people they affected. At the head of the table sat Brian Carter, the CEO of Pioneer National Bank, a man in his early 60s who had always projected an image of authority and control. To his right was Linda Ford, the head of the bank's customer relations department, a woman who had always seemed pleasant in their dealings but now looked somewhat uncomfortable. And, of course, there was Thomas Reynolds, who looked visibly tense, his posture rigid and his hands clasped tightly together. "Ms. Matthews," Brian began, his voice measured and formal, "thank you for coming in. We're here today to discuss the situation that occurred last week, and I want to assure you that we take your concerns seriously." Tina nodded, though she couldn't help but notice the subtle defensiveness in Brian's tone. It was as if he were already trying to downplay the situation, as if his first instinct was to protect Thomas. She wasn't there for sympathy, though. She was there for accountability. "Thank you for having me," Tina said, her voice calm but firm. "I'm here today because I believe that what happened at the bank last week was more than just an isolated incident. It's about how people in power can treat others, how they can dismiss or degrade people without even realizing it. I don't want to see that happen to anyone else." Thomas shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "Ms. Matthews, I'm not here to hear your excuses, Mr. Reynolds," Tina interrupted. "What I want is accountability. I want to make sure that you understand how your actions affected me, and how they've affected this community. People are talking about it, and it's not just about me anymore. It's about how our community can change for the better. You had a chance to make a simple business transaction, and instead, you made a judgment. A judgment based on nothing more than the color of my skin and your preconceived notions. The room fell silent. Tina's words hung in the air like a heavy cloud, and for a moment, no one seemed to know how to respond. Brian cleared his throat, glancing at Linda and then back at Tina. I think it's fair to say that Thomas did not handle the situation appropriately, he said, his tone softening. We'll be looking into this matter further. I appreciate that, Tina replied, her voice steady. But let's be clear. This isn't just about one person's mistake. It's about creating a culture where people are treated equally, regardless of their background or status. I'm not asking for any special treatment. I'm asking for fairness. And I'm asking for a change that will ensure this never happens again. The meeting went on for another hour, but by the end of it, Tina felt she had made her point. The bank had promised to review its internal policies, to provide additional training on unconscious bias, and to ensure that everyone, from customers to employees, would be treated with the respect they deserved. But Tina knew this was just the beginning. The ripple effect of her actions had already begun to spread, and whether Thomas Reynolds realized it or not, he had just been a small part of a much larger conversation. As Tina left the meeting, her lawyer by her side, she couldn't help but feel a sense of quiet triumph. She had done more than just stand up for herself. She had made a statement to her community, one that would have lasting effects. She had shown them that the time for silence was over. The fight for respect, for equality, for justice, was just beginning, and Tina Matthews was at the forefront of it. In the weeks that followed, the fallout from Tina's confrontation with Pioneer National Bank rippled across the town, and the tension surrounding the incident didn't die down as quickly as Tina had hoped. Her name was on everyone's lips, whether it was praise or criticism didn't matter. People in the community had become polarized, and the controversy had ignited a firestorm of conversation. Some supported Tina, applauding her courage and determination to hold the bank accountable. Others, though, felt that she had blown the situation out of proportion, claiming that it was simply a misunderstanding, a mistake made by an overworked manager. But Tina knew better. She wasn't fighting for her own dignity anymore, she was fighting for something far greater. Soon, the local media outlets began digging deeper into the story, with Emma Hayes from the Town Gazette continuing her investigation. Tina found herself repeatedly interviewed, sharing her perspective on what had transpired and her hopes for a more just and equal community. The town seemed to watch her every move, and while it was exhausting, she also couldn't help but feel a growing sense of empowerment. Then, one fateful evening, Tina received an unexpected call. It was Brian Carter, the CEO of Pioneer National Bank, requesting a private meeting. Tina was cautious at first, after all, she had already made her demands clear. But something in Brian's voice struck her. He didn't sound defensive, nor did he sound like he was trying to downplay the situation. There was a quiet tone of sincerity in his words. I'd like to apologize again, Tina. But I also want to do more than apologize. I think we can turn this into an opportunity to truly make a difference in our community, Brian said. Can we meet tomorrow? I want to discuss how we can work together on this. Tina was skeptical but agreed to the meeting. The next day, she found herself sitting across from Brian in a small, private room at the bank. He was older than she had remembered, his face showing the wear of years of leadership, but there was a sincerity in his eyes. I don't expect you to forgive me, Tina, he began. What happened at the bank was unacceptable, and I want you to know that I've learned a lot from this. I'm committed to making sure something like this never happens again, not just at this bank but in this town. And I'd like your help to make sure that becomes a reality. Tina leaned forward, her arms crossed in front of her, but she couldn't hide the flicker of interest in her eyes. What exactly are you proposing? I've spoken with the board, Brian said, and we're planning to launch a series of initiatives aimed at increasing diversity, inclusion, and education in this community. We want to partner with local businesses, schools, and organizations to create a space for open dialogue about race and inequality. I'd like for you to be a part of that. Not as a victim of this incident, but as a leader who can help guide this change. Tina was silent for a moment, absorbing his words. She had been prepared to fight this battle alone, to hold the bank accountable by sheer force of will. But now, Brian was offering her a chance to transform the situation, to turn it into something positive. She had spent so long fighting for her own dignity, for the recognition that she deserved, that the idea of taking on such a responsibility seemed both daunting and exciting. "I'm not sure what I can offer," she said cautiously. "But if this is real, if you're serious about making change, then maybe we can do something. But understand this, Brian, I won't stand for token gestures or empty promises. This has to be genuine." Brian nodded vigorously. "I understand, Tina. I promise, we'll do the work. It's not just about you and me. It's about our entire community. We need to create a culture where people are valued for who they are, not what they look like or where they come from." The next few weeks were filled with meetings, planning sessions, and collaborations. Tina worked alongside Brian, Linda, and other community leaders to create a series of events that would bring together individuals from all walks of life. They organized a community town hall, where residents could share their experiences and perspectives, and local leaders from all backgrounds were invited to speak on issues of race, inclusion, and systemic inequality. It wasn't easy. Some people were hesitant to participate, afraid that the conversation would be too uncomfortable. Others were outright resistant, unwilling to acknowledge that there was a problem to begin with. But Tina, with her experience and her determination, was a powerful force in the room, urging people to face the difficult truths they had been avoiding. The events were a success. They sparked meaningful discussions that carried on long after the meetings ended. Tina's role as a leader in these efforts was acknowledged, and she began to see a real shift in the town's attitude. People who had once been indifferent or dismissive of the conversation about race were now engaging in it, sometimes reluctantly, but engaging nonetheless. It was the beginning of something bigger. But the changes didn't stop with the community. At Pioneer National Bank, there were visible efforts to ensure that the organization took real, tangible steps toward greater diversity and inclusion. The bank rolled out a new set of policies that emphasized respect, equal treatment, and a commitment to diversity in hiring and customer service. They launched a training program for all employees, addressing unconscious bias and teaching them how to handle difficult situations with empathy and professionalism. Tina had become an integral part of that transformation, not just as a local businesswoman but as a symbol of strength and resilience. She had taken something that could have been a mere personal affront and turned it into a force for widespread change. But not everyone was pleased with the new direction. As expected, some members of the community pushed back against the idea of change. They didn't want to confront uncomfortable truths, and they saw Tina as an outsider stirring the pot. One evening, as Tina was closing up her bakery, she overheard a heated conversation between a couple of regular customers. "They're all making a big deal out of nothing," one man said. "It's just the way the world is. She shouldn't have caused all this drama. There was no need for all the fuss." Tina stood still for a moment, hearing their words clearly, but she didn't let their negativity seep into her. Instead, she held her head high, knowing that what she had started was far bigger than her own battles. She wasn't just changing the way people saw her, she was changing the way they saw each other. And as the town slowly began to shift toward a more inclusive future, Tina realized that the confrontation at the bank had been the catalyst for something far more profound than she could have ever imagined. What started as a personal moment of frustration had ignited a transformation in both her life and the community at large. It was a reminder that one person could make a difference, even in the face of overwhelming odds. And as Tina stood in the bakery that night, she smiled, knowing that, despite the challenges ahead, she had sparked a change that would echo for years to come. Months passed, and the transformation in the town began to solidify. What started as a heated confrontation between Tina Matthews and Thomas Reynolds had evolved into something far larger than anyone could have predicted. The initial tension and division had given way to collaboration, as community leaders, businesses, and everyday residents came together to have difficult but necessary conversations. Tina's bakery had become a place of refuge for many, a symbol of resilience and progress. As people from all walks of life began to stop by, some to enjoy the food she baked, others to share their thoughts on the ongoing change, Tina found herself at the center of a quiet revolution. It wasn't always easy. The road to real change was often rocky, with setbacks and moments of frustration. Tina had to fight for every inch of progress, especially when it came to convincing some of the more resistant members of the town to engage with the issues of racial inequality that had been swept under the rug for so long. But each step forward, no matter how small, felt like a victory. The town's open dialogue sessions continued to grow in number, and the discussions had begun to take on a life of their own. The more people talked, the more they realized that the issues Tina had raised weren't just abstract concepts, they were personal. They affected everyone, whether they realized it or not. Tina had become a recognized figure, not only for the courage she had shown but for the wisdom and grace with which she navigated the challenges that came with being in the spotlight. People in town no longer saw her just as the businesswoman who had been unfairly treated at the bank, they saw her as a leader, someone who was shaping the future of their community. And for Tina, that was a strange but powerful realization. She had never set out to become a leader, but the circumstances had pushed her into a position where her actions could inspire change on a scale she never expected. It wasn't just about fighting for justice anymore. It was about creating a space where others could see the value of that fight and take part in it themselves. One evening, a few months after the initial incident, Tina received an unexpected invitation. It was from Pioneer National Bank, or more specifically from Brian Carter, the CEO who had played a pivotal role in the aftermath. The bank had invited Tina to a gala they were hosting to celebrate their new initiatives for diversity and inclusion, and more specifically, to honor Tina for her role in pushing the conversation forward. Tina hesitated at first. She had no need for accolades or attention, what mattered to her was the work that still needed to be done. But as she thought about it, she realized that this gala could serve as a moment to reflect on how far they had come and, more importantly, how much further they needed to go. That night, as she entered the grand ballroom of the local hotel, Tina was struck by how different things felt. The room was filled with people from all over the town, people who had once been on opposing sides of the debate, people who had once been indifferent to the issues Tina had raised, people who had been silent for far too long. But tonight, they were all there, celebrating the progress they had made and acknowledging the work still ahead. Brian, standing at the front of the room, welcomed Tina with a warm handshake, his expression sincere. "Tina," Brian said, his voice carrying across the room. "I don't think any of us could have predicted how much impact this moment would have on all of us. What you did that day, standing up to Thomas, started something that none of us could have imagined. Your courage has ignited a movement, and tonight, we're here to honor you, not just for the change you've sparked but for the way you've led by example." The applause that followed was overwhelming. Tina stood there for a moment, humbled by the recognition but also overwhelmed by the significance of the moment. She had come a long way since that day at the bank, but there was still so much more work to be done. As she took the stage to address the crowd, she spoke from the heart. "Thank you, all of you," Tina began, her voice steady but filled with emotion. "This journey hasn't been easy, and there have been times when I wanted to give up, to walk away and leave it all behind. But then I remembered why I couldn't. Because this isn't just about me. It's about every person who has ever been made to feel small, invisible, or less than. It's about every person who has ever been told they don't belong or that their voice doesn't matter. And it's about all of us coming together to say, no more." The room was silent as Tina spoke, the weight of her words hanging in the air. She wasn't just thanking the people in the room, she was reminding them of their collective responsibility to continue the work that had begun. It wasn't enough to simply acknowledge the progress they had made. True change required sustained effort, and Tina was determined to see it through. As the evening wore on, Tina found herself surrounded by familiar faces. People who had once seen her as just a local businesswoman were now asking for her advice, her thoughts on how they could contribute to the ongoing effort to make the town a more inclusive place. Tina realized that this wasn't just about the events that had happened to her, it was about a shift in perspective. People were beginning to see their roles in the larger picture, and they were ready to take action. The conversations continued late into the night, and for the first time in a long time, Tina felt a sense of peace. But the next day, as Tina returned to her bakery, she was reminded that the work was far from over. A local customer, someone she had seen many times but never really spoken to, came up to her as she was preparing a batch of croissants. The woman, a middle-aged teacher from the local high school, looked at Tina with a mixture of respect and hesitation. "I just wanted to thank you," the woman said, her voice soft. "I didn't realize how much I had been ignoring these issues, even though I knew they were there. Your courage has inspired me to do better, to be more aware of the way I treat others. I'm starting a program at the school to teach our kids about inclusion and empathy. It's a small step, but I think it's a good one." Tina smiled, the weight of the woman's words sinking in. This was the true impact of the changes she had helped create, not just the discussions in boardrooms or at community events, but the personal transformations happening every day. The small steps that people were taking, individually and collectively, were what would lead to lasting change. And so, Tina's journey continued, not as a symbol of victimhood but as a beacon of hope, a reminder that even the smallest acts of defiance could lead to a ripple effect that would change the world. She had transformed her town, one conversation, one person, at a time. And as she looked around at the people who were working alongside her, she knew the work wasn't finished, but they were on the right path. It was a journey that would never truly end, but that was exactly why she had started it in the first place. The town of Oakwood had changed in ways no one could have predicted. What had begun as a tense, polarizing incident in the lobby of Pioneer National Bank had sparked a movement, one that brought the community closer together, even in the face of deep-rooted divisions. Tina Matthews, once just a local bakery owner, had now become an influential figure, a voice for change, equality, and progress. It wasn't an easy journey, and there were still battles to be fought, but Oakwood had undeniably shifted. What Tina realized, however, was that the road ahead wasn't just about pushing for change, it was about maintaining it, nurturing it, and making sure it didn't fade into the background once the headlines stopped. Months after the gala, Tina had been involved in more projects than she could have imagined. The diversity and inclusion programs in local schools had taken root. Teachers were integrating lessons on empathy, racial history, and community into their curricula, while businesses were slowly but surely starting to reflect the diversity of the town's population. Conversations that once felt awkward or uncomfortable were now happening naturally in cafes, at town hall meetings, and at local businesses. The changes were tangible, though they were far from perfect. There were still moments of resistance, moments when Tina would see the old biases creeping back into the conversation, when people tried to avoid uncomfortable truths. But there was something different now. People were listening, even if they didn't always understand. One particular project that had come to fruition was the opening of a new community center, an initiative led by Tina, Brian Carter, and a coalition of local leaders. The center would serve as a place for education, support, and dialogue, where people of all backgrounds could come together to learn, share their experiences, and build stronger relationships. It wasn't just about addressing racial issues, although that was an important focus. The center aimed to bridge any gap that existed in the community, whether it was about class, education, or any other barrier that had kept people apart. It was a bold step toward creating a more unified Oakwood, and Tina had poured her heart and soul into its development. But even as the town continued to evolve, Tina faced a more personal challenge. Despite the community's progress, her life was not immune to the complexities of change. As Tina's role as a leader grew, so did the pressure. Her bakery was thriving, yes, but running it while spearheading initiatives for the town left her drained. She had once thought her dream was to simply run a bakery, to bake the best bread and pastries in town. But now, her life had become a delicate balancing act, where her personal time was constantly encroached upon by meetings, interviews, and endless phone calls. Her family life, once a peaceful sanctuary, felt strained, and she couldn't help but wonder if the fight for change had begun to take its toll. Her husband, Derek Matthews, who had always supported her, began to voice his concerns. Derek had always been her anchor, the one person who understood the quiet moments of doubt she experienced. But lately, it seemed like their conversations were centered around Tina's exhaustion, her mounting responsibilities, and the toll it was taking on her health. "You can't do it all, Tina," Derek said one evening after dinner, his voice soft but firm. "I know you want to change everything, but you're only human. We need you here with us, too." Tina looked at him, guilt flooding her chest. "I know, Derek. But I can't stop now. This is bigger than me. It's bigger than all of us." "I know," he replied, taking her hand. "But don't forget, we're a part of this too. You don't have to carry all of it on your shoulders alone. We're a team." His words struck a chord with her. She had become so consumed by the cause, so caught up in the momentum of change, that she had forgotten the importance of balance. She had started this journey because she wanted to make the world a better place, not just for the town, but for her family as well. It was time for her to recalibrate, to find a way to lead without losing herself in the process. The next few weeks were a turning point for Tina. She decided to delegate more of her responsibilities to others. She found herself leaning more on the team at the bakery and the growing network of community leaders who had supported her from the beginning. The community center, too, had begun to run on its own momentum, with leaders like Brian Carter, local activists, and teachers taking charge of the programs. Tina no longer felt the weight of the world pressing down on her, but rather the satisfaction of knowing that the groundwork she had laid would continue to grow without her constant involvement. And then came the day of the ribbon-cutting ceremony for the Oakwood Community Center, a culmination of months of hard work. Tina stood at the front of a crowd that had gathered in front of the center, the warm sun casting a glow over the bustling town square. As she prepared to speak, she saw the familiar faces of so many people who had become a part of this journey, the teachers, the business owners, the activists, and the everyday citizens who had come together to make a difference. But the most meaningful sight was seeing Derek and their 2 children standing in the crowd, smiling with pride. Tina stepped up to the podium, her heart full. "Today is not just about the opening of a building," she began, her voice steady but emotional. "It's about the opening of possibilities. We've built something here, but it's not just walls and windows, it's a space for conversation, for understanding, and for growth. It's a place where we can look each other in the eye and say, we are all in this together. This is a reminder that change doesn't come from one person. It comes from the collective will of a community, united in its desire to create something better. This center is for all of us, because we all have a part to play in the future we want to build." The crowd erupted in applause, and Tina's eyes welled with tears. She looked out over the sea of faces, and for the first time in a long time, she felt a sense of peace. She had started a movement, but now, she was watching that movement flourish without her having to drive it forward every day. The town was changing, but it was no longer just her fight. It was everyone's fight. Later that evening, as Tina sat with her family, watching the sunset from their porch, she reflected on how far they had come. The incident at the bank had been the spark, but the fire of change was now alive, fueled by the energy, passion, and dedication of a community that refused to stand still. It wasn't perfect, and there was still work to be done. But as she looked at Derek and their children, Tina knew that the future was bright, not just for her town, but for everyone who had been a part of this journey. She had proven that one person could make a difference, but it was the collective power of a community coming together that would create lasting change. The road ahead would be filled with challenges, but Tina knew that they were ready for whatever came next. Because Oakwood had found its voice, and that voice would never be silenced again.